Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Most B2B marketers understand the benefits of having a podcast. When you run a show for your company, it helps the organization learn from customers, connect with influencers, and provide a perspective on what's happening in the industry. But even though a podcast offers a lot of benefits to a brand, companies still struggle to identify when it's the best time to get started with their own show. Should you launch a podcast for your early stage startup, or should you wait until the product is more mature? And what about the size of your team? When is it right to launch a podcast based on the folks that you have internally? Well, in this episode, I have Brett McGrath on the show. Brett is the VP of Marketing at The Juice, a curated discovery platform for marketing and sales content. The Juice just officially launched in 2020, and the reason I had Brett on the show was to uncover why he decided to develop a podcast during the very early stages of the company's journey. So let's jump in to find out. Well, Brett, first of all, thanks for joining me on Recorded Content today.
Tristan, thanks so much for having me. I always feels like I'm the host of these conversations most of the time, so I love being able to be in the guest seat and just responding in real time and letting it come at me. So thanks for having me.
That's right. Well, let's come at you with the first question. How about that? I have a very serious question for you. Would you consider yourself more of a wrestling nerd or a B2B marketing nerd, and why?
Wrestling nerd, 100%. I've been mesmerized by the stories, the bright lights, and the characters since I was 3 years old. I remember being at Toys R Us with my mom and looking over and seeing a guy with face paint on, and it just stood out to me. And it was for any wrestling nerds out there listening, it was Demolition Smash, and I had to have the action figure. Then that led to me watching wrestling, WWF at the time, on TV, and I've just been hooked ever since. So it's kind of my escape away from B2B marketing. I love B2B marketing, but I love wrestling a lot more.
All right, very cool. Yeah, I had to know before we got into anything else. If you have a podcast around that, I'll link out to it too, just so folks can see the other side of Brett. Well, cool. Well, today we're going to focus on the B2B marketing side in this podcast. And I would say, it was fun to dive into some of the other stuff you have going on, but the Juice is where you work now at the moment, and one of the big headlines that's on the company's website is the Juice is the last form you'll ever have to fill out to get the best B2B sales and marketing content. So for folks who aren't familiar with the Juice, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so the Juice is a content discovery platform that is connecting sales and marketing professionals with the right resources across the internet in one platform. So we've all been through that experience in our job where we need to learn and we go to Google and we get hit by a bunch of unhelpful blog posts. And then when we think we find something, we are hit with a forum, we fill out a form, and before we even can read the piece of content, we're being called by a sales professional. So we've all felt that, and that's a problem on the consumer side that we're working every day to solve. And then on the brand side, there's that sea of content out there, and we want to help brands match their best work with the right people. So we want to be that primary distribution channel for B2B brands. All
right. Love it. And the Juice is brand new. I mean, it was created in 2020. I think it was just actually launched this year based on what I saw. So one of the things, of course, that's important with a brand new company is talking with customers. We're hearing that more and more. Everyone says it's not really a new concept, but it's like, hey, you need to talk to customers and really get to know them. But before you talk, you have to listen. And that's something that you actually alluded to in one of the earlier episodes of your company's podcast. And that brings me to the 3Cs podcast, right? So I listened to the first episode, and it was recorded actually 2 weeks after you started with the company. So very early on in your role there. So why was starting a podcast such an important thing for you to do in your role at the Juice?
So you hit on a couple of those things right out of the gates. I would say first, podcasting in the medium is very comfortable to me. You mentioned kind of side projects. I have a side project that involves a podcast. I've had podcasts at other companies that I've worked for, and that when I jumped back in, it had been a while since I had spoken to B2B marketers. I had worked in software and other industries. So I started the 3C podcast as a way to level up my learning around the individuals that we want to speak with regularly. And you get through a couple of those episodes and you realize quickly that, wow, I'm not only creating content, I'm building relationships, and the people on the show are saying things that I can then go back and share with my product team as we're trying to build out our solution. So it's not just that, like, let's check this box, let's start doing content, so let's create a podcast. It really is and touches everything we're doing at the Juice, and that's how we think about it. We think about it very strategically, and it's really helped me meet some really great people early, less than a year being in the business. So I can go on, and I'm sure we will, about just the functional use of the podcast.
Yeah, we'll get into that. And even before we do, I was curious, with the other experience you have with spinning up podcasts. I think I heard somewhere that you've put together 3 different podcasts in the last year, like you mentioned, the side projects. From those experiences, how did you create the theme or the premise for this podcast 3Cs with the Juice? Like, how did that work? What's your process there?
Yeah, so I think for me, everyone will say B2B content is sterile and B2B content sucks and it's not as exciting as B2C content. I think that's true in some cases, but not all cases. And really what I wanted to do, and I felt as we were building out the company, building out what our product was going to do, building out our go-to-market strategy, I really wanted to show the people behind the content at brands and have the individuals tell their stories, talk about why they're doing things, talk about their backgrounds. And my mindset was, the more we shine light on the people behind the content at the brands, the more we will learn about the brands and what they're about, and then ultimately hope to develop trust. So that's really kind of my mindset, was that this narrative was being shared everywhere I went in my early conversations. And so I picked up on that narrative and I said, well, wait a minute, like, let me spend some time trying to dig in and not talk about the brand, but talk about the people who are doing the work, and then see what happens on the other side. So that was really the catalyst for the 3C podcast, which stands for Curating Content Creators.
When you're 2 weeks into a role, like, what did leadership think about this idea? Is this something you had to present, or, I mean, you're brand new and it's like, I want to get this podcast off the ground. What did that look like?
So I actually brought it up before I signed my offer letter. That's how important it was. And I wanted to make sure that our CEO understood the reasons and the why behind it before I entered the Juice as employee number 2 or 3. We can argue with our growth manager on who gets that. Maybe we'll flip a coin someday.
There we go.
But yeah, it was really, I wanted to make him understand that it wasn't about the downloads, it wasn't about the listens, and sure, we were going to measure those things, but that wasn't all about. I really wanted his buy-in on the strategic vision that I had with the podcast. And he's a former marketer, so he understood it and said, just go. And that's the primary work that I've been doing ever since I started, or I view as my most important work, because I get the opportunity to meet new people that are in our market that potentially someday down the road could be a paying customer of the juice. And I'm not only building relationships with them, I'm building trust and laying that groundwork. And any long game, or I call them modern day marketers, know that it's not transactional. It's all about building relationships. And that's really the purpose behind the show from my end, is just to meet people who I can learn from and our audience can learn from, and build and develop those relationships.
And so, Brett, with those ideas that you're talking about, those objectives up front, did you actually put it in a document? What did it look like? Was there a creative brief that existed internally? I'm always curious to know what the genesis of a podcast looks like.
So I wrote a letter. I wrote a letter as to our audience that I understood at the time, and the letter was about why I was doing this show, why I thought that mattered to anyone listening, and ultimately the value that I was looking to offer anyone who came by the juicehq.com, stumbled across the podcaster page. They understood quickly and immediately, wow, there's something here that I might be able to hit play and learn from. So it was really outward facing initially, and then of course I shared that letter internally before I hit publish, but that really set the stage, and I think got our team to rally around the purpose and intention behind it. And I think a lot of marketers do this. I certainly, with age and as I've gotten a little more grizzled in the B2B land, I focus a lot less on me and my metrics and a lot more on the audience that we're building and what they really care about. So that was the approach that I took right out of the gates.
I love that. I haven't really heard that before. But writing a letter, it's interesting because you typically write a letter to one person, right? It's a one-to-one thing. So I don't know if that was done on purpose, but I mean, that's really the intention behind a podcast too. Like you said, it's that one-to-one relationship building. So it sounds like you started off at the very front end of this with that mindset. Okay, so if you have this letter in place, and it sounds like you got your theme intact, what was the hardest part to get to hitting record?
Yeah, so I think for me, and I'll touch on something you previously said around the one-to-one. I think all the feedback and all the good podcasts that I listen to, it feels like you're sitting right there alongside the individual or individuals having a conversation. And for anyone I'd say that's thinking about starting a podcast, like, there's plenty of books and things that you can go read about them, but like I recommend going back to the classics, and the classics to me are things like Ogilvy on Advertising, where his themes are all about that one-to-one writing and speaking and being able to reach your end consumer in a way. So I'm a student of the game on with some of the old classics, and I've infused that into the work that I'm currently doing. The hardest part for me, I think, was the decision-making around the profile of individuals that I wanted to bring on the show. And, being in a startup land, it's tough, and it takes people, sometimes several years to figure out exactly who their ideal customer profile it is. So I wrestled around with that for a while because there was just some uncertainty there on our end exactly who was, but I used it as an opportunity to meet with marketers of different backgrounds, different years of experience, different roles, with the one theme that they spend a large portion of their time in content. And so the hardest part was trying to get to that point where it was like, okay, this has got to be a done better than perfect thing. Let me start getting people on the show. And then it was the asking and the process of bringing people in and getting them to understand why them and why I was reaching out to those people who I didn't currently have a relationship with. So sales is everywhere. If you're in marketing, you're in sales. And it was just getting my sales process going, or how was I going to sell myself and what I believed in and my philosophy, and with the wrapper of this is the show, to get people to see my pitch, understand who I was as a person, and then agree to that 10 to 15 minute intro call where I do a lot of listening, but I also do whatever I can to get the individual to trust me and what I'm about. So there's alignment there before they agree and go into that episode.
Yeah. So in your alluding to the guests and getting the right folks on the show, and that leads me to a question that I had was, you actually started the 3Cs podcast with a solo episode, and then you brought on the founder. Those were the first 2 episodes. So can you walk through why you went that direction versus coming out of the gate with a guest initially?
So I think for us, there's 2 primary purposes for the show. We release 2 episodes a week. It's bookending your week. We've got one on Monday. We've got one on Friday. The Monday episode is an episode to get our audience to understand the juice and the individuals behind the juice. So I brought Jonathan on early. He was the one who, for 6 months, was working solo, having 100 conversations with 100 marketers. And it was kind of like a passing the baton where I needed to share his perspective on what he had been doing and what he was focused in order for the show and what we were building to make sense at all with individuals. And after I got done with that episode, I thought, you know what, like there's this whole like build in public thing that's going on where people, which is great, people are being authentic, people are being transparent, and I really viewed this is an opportunity on a weekly basis to not only do a show where we're sharing ideas of other people, but share what we're working on, share the good, bad, and the ugly. And that's what we've been doing the entire year, is doing 2 episodes, one focused on roadblocks, things we're working on, how we launched the company, things that we believe are going to matter to the people listening, and then get more focused on the content side by bringing someone in who is a subject matter expert who is working on something that we believe can help educate our audience. So that was kind of the primary purpose of starting with Jonathan, and it evolved into this is probably something we should do on a weekly basis alongside the content conversations.
Yes, I saw you mention that, or I heard you mention that in a podcast episode where one of the primary objectives was to show your work, and that involved bringing on internal folks periodically is like just milestone markers along the way. So do you feel it's important to do that because the juice is brand new and there's like this element of that startup from scratch? Or do you feel like, let's say if you are a more mature organization, that it is still applicable in a podcast format? What's your take on that?
Yes to both of them. I think for us at the Juice, no one knows we exist. We just got started. So creating content and conversations that's valuable to the audience that we're building, while also using individuals who are our guests as a distribution channel to drive awareness around who we are and what we do, it's a no-brainer. And I think for maybe more mature organizations, I think there's an opportunity to use a platform like a podcast to begin to share some of that knowledge from internally and from your customers, to rebrand maybe is a strong word, but to pump some energy around the brand that already exists. I mean, this is how people are being educated today. People are going to YouTube. People are hitting Spotify, listening to the podcast. I'm always going to be a writer, and I'm always going to tell everyone that they should write and focus on writing, but you got to understand consumer expectations and what's changed and what's happening and the rise of these new mediums. And to me, if you're not publishing regularly through audio channel or through video channel, you're missing out big time, because especially the younger demographic of buyers that you're trying to reach will never know you exist if you're not where they go to consume content on a regular basis.
Yeah, and Brett, you hit on this publishing concept, and I went back, and the 3C started in January, and you have, I believe, over 70 episodes now. So the original goal was to do it twice a week. You've remained incredibly consistent. So congratulations for that. So I have to ask, like, what is the hardest thing to maintain that consistency now that you're sitting here, 70 plus episodes in?
I think the hardest thing for me is the management of conversations to go live date and how I set those expectations with the people that have given me their time to be on our show and share their point of view. I'm sure you can relate with this, Tristan, at some level, but I have a ton of conversations. I had 3 recordings to close out my day yesterday. Those 3 recordings aren't going to all go live next week. It's going to be spread out over a period of time based on our release schedule. Now, I might speak with someone on a Wednesday in September, and their podcast episode doesn't go live until after Thanksgiving. I need to be able to, as someone who's earned that time, set those expectations and keep in touch with those individuals and let them know, hey, your episode was actually great. I learned a ton, but we've got these themes going on, and your theme is up next, and we've got this backlog. So I think that's the hardest part, and that's something about halfway through of it, I'd start getting emails like, hey, is my episode ever going to go live? And that's when I started to know I needed to incorporate a communication loop back to the individual ahead of when their episode was going to go live to make sure that they knew what the expectations were and they were prepared to help when the time was right.
And it's a tricky balance because you do want somewhat of a backlog, so you give yourself some lead time to produce the assets and get everything in place for publishing. But at the same time, like you're talking about, where you don't want so much of a backlog where folks are like 2, 3, 4 months out, then they forget what the damn conversation was about by the time it comes there. So I thought it was interesting because one of the things we've found on our side is like the solo episode format helps us fill in some gaps and build some lead time. So do you find that approach helps you, that format? Because you could just jump on the mic with an idea and maybe record a 15 to 20 minute episode that'll serve as one of those published episodes for that week. Does that help you overall maintain consistency?
I think for me, what the hardest part, yes, it does help, but the hardest part for me has moved from not the Friday episodes where I'm speaking with content marketers. There has been, I'm very grateful for this, but the show has got attention. People, it's focused. People understand the guest profile. People listen to it and they say, you know what, like, I think I'd be a good guest on this, or I think someone that I'm working with would be a good guest. And we're getting that inbound now from the show, which is awesome. So from a consistency perspective, and I'll say this to anyone listening, like if you're in content and you're in B2B and you're doing cool stuff, like reach out to me. I want to talk to you. Like I'm never not having conversations, but that engine's moving from an inbound perspective and from me reaching out to guests that I'd love to have on the show. I think the difficult part and the challenge has been, okay, so I've got that engine rolling. Now on the internal side, like how do I create our structure around Monday episodes so it's not just, it doesn't feel like us just talking about stuff, but there's a structure behind it. And so I've been talking a lot about the modern day marketer, and the modern day marketer really is the individual who I'm interviewing on the podcast on a regular basis, but picking up these themes about how these individuals think about things like tracking, how they distribute content, why they're not concerned with lead volume. Like I'm picking up all of these themes from these individuals and creating a profile that I'm calling the modern day marketer. Now, since I talk with them on Fridays, on Mondays, I'm using that as a way to educate around the things that behind the scenes I'm learning from these calls and why I'm calling people modern day marketers and what they're about. So I think that has been the hardest part for me, is to finally get to that point on Monday where it's like, all right, now I have a structure around the what, and now I just need to build in whether it's pulling Jonathan, our CEO, pulling Kat, who's in customer success, pulling in these individuals to help validate some of what I've been writing about, some of what I've been tweeting about, some of what's in our weekly newsletter.
Yeah, and Brett, let's dive into that a little bit, because it sounds like you have a lot of pieces, right? So you have you have these interviews with your modern day marketers. You're helping define that as you go, and then for these episodes where you're pulling in internal folks, you say you're taking a big idea. What does it look like? Are you putting like pencil to paper to draw out that structure? Like, how do you then formulate a solo or an internal podcast that reflects on some of those ideas?
Yeah, so the macro theme would be modern day marketers, and then what I do is I'll give the individual, if it's not a solo run, about a week heads up on, hey, I need you on this episode. This is why I need you. And here's the structure. I'm not going to give you the questions because I don't really know the questions until you start talking. So here's the structure of what I want to talk about. And that's really how it goes. And then some weeks I'll plan for the blog and the content that I'm writing, and I'll say, okay, well, this week I'm writing a piece on what is the modern day marketer and defining the qualities. Then I'll have a companion piece to help support that. That's audio, so I can fill in some of the color on some of what I wrote. So that's how it's working right now for me, and it seems to be working in this world where there's a lot going on. And I'm getting good feedback internally on just structure and involvement. And is it perfect? Absolutely not. I think yesterday I recorded an episode in our first series for Modern Day Marketers. We're talking about the things and the problems with the old way to do B2B marketing and what modern day marketers are doing different. I'm pulled in Jonathan. We've got this 4-part mini series that's going on, and he's out fundraising. He's busy doing that. I'm busy having conversations, and we got to at the morning of, and he knew it was on the calendar, but I messaged him and just was like, oops. But I sent him the structure, gave him enough time to digest it. And then we ended up having a pretty good conversation yesterday around it. So it's kind of managed chaos, but it's working right now.
Yeah. Managed chaos is a good way of putting it. And I think that's an obstacle some folks can overcome is, okay, like in your situation, you still recorded. It wasn't perfect. You didn't have everything lined up, but you still felt good enough, comfortable enough to hit record. And I feel like that's a barrier for a lot of folks. It's like, oh, I'll just push this off next week. And then once you do that once or twice, then it becomes acceptable. And then that's when you lose out on that consistency. So, but you talked about some other things here. And I think what's interesting is how you're tying the conversations and the podcast content, you're writing content from that and producing all these different formats, and it's all working together. Why do you think a lot of folks just check the box on a podcast versus really integrating it in with a lot of the other content they're creating from an overarching marketing perspective?
I think it's just because it's easy to check the box, and I think it's hard to get a podcast started. You being in the space, I'm sure you've heard it. Everyone always says, well, I've thought about starting a podcast. Well, just go do the podcast. Like, I look back, I don't want to, but listening back, like on the first few episodes of the 3C podcast, I'm sure they weren't the best. I'm sure the quality of the product has been refined just because reps and sets matter in podcasting and having conversations. So I think, and a lot of things that I hear too on my conversations with the show is that they're different. The bigger the organization is, the more dispersed the roles and responsibilities are, and teams own writing and teams own audio production. So there's silos within these marketing teams around content that they're producing, which is, I think, a great thing for content and just content marketing in general. It's part of the reason we're stepping in and we want to help solve this problem is there's too much content that teams are siloed around what they're doing. So I think for me, one of the things that I've heard this and what I wanted to do early was get our internal team involved in all of our content, whether it was, hey, I don't want to be the only one writing. I don't want to be the only one on the podcast. I view my role as not only a creator, but a facilitator. And so I think the more marketers can think, content people, strategists, marketers, whatever your role is, think about what you do as a facilitator, the better quality content you'll have, and the more integrated your content will be across your entire marketing strategy. That's what I've picked up on from listening to hundreds of people talk about what they're doing over the last 9 months, and it's something that I'm putting into practice at the Juice.
Yeah, I love it. The most effective podcasters I know are really pulling in a lot of other folks within their organization. Just because it builds momentum, some excitement around the show, and it also just feels like everyone's involved. So you're obviously having folks appear on the show. How are you sharing the podcast internally? Obviously, you're producing it and publishing externally, but is there anything special you do internally to bring out some more visibility there?
This is something that I wish as a marketer I focused more on earlier in my career, and that's the internal activation of the work that you're producing to get other people who you work with not only on board, but sharing outward and, showcasing your stuff. And I think a lot of marketers have ideas and things that have worked for them and things that might have worked for a little bit but trailed off. But I think the way I thought about this is to look at my team and think, all right, where's my team at every day? What are those meetings? What are those things that we're doing where I can always share out the work that I'm doing on the content front? They can understand the message, and then they can share it out across their channels. And it's no rocket science, but just starting it early. We have a channel in Slack that we call social promotion. And social promotion is when I publish something, I spend time making sure that I package up the article, the episode, whatever it is, and share out all of the channels that I have promoted it on, all in one message, and I give a why behind, like, this is why I did this, and I'll just plug it in the channel. Everyone will see it. People, juice box emojis. Okay, I see other people see it too. And then I'll be in a meeting. I'll look down at my phone, and the engagement has already started from my team, whether it's the likes, whether it's the retweets, whether it's the shares. And to me, that's the proudest thing I think I've done since I've joined the Juice, or the thing that I'm really happy is happening right now, is the fact that I'm working at the smallest company I've ever worked at, but it's the strongest internal advocates that I've ever worked with, and it's because people are bought in a process, and that reflects on your company, that reflects on your culture. People see that and they say, you know what, like, I saw a job rec out at the Juice for a design role, like, their team is super active on social. It seems like they really like what they're doing. You know what? I'm going to go apply for that design role because I want to know what it's all about. So it really hits on just activating internally and doing it in a way that's easy and explains. Like, it really can help not only with your marketing, building awareness, but it can help with culture building and just recruitment.
Yeah, I love that. There are a lot of indirect benefits to a podcast that a lot of people don't really factor in early on, and those you've listed out here. A lot of it is on the internal side where you get some of that collaboration going that previously didn't exist because there were silos in place. You have like a video producer, you have a designer, everyone's working on these isolated projects, and it's very difficult to tie together. So it sounds like the podcast is really doing that for you, and it's great because it's early on in the company's journey. So I wanted to ask, like, for you as a marketer, one of the things...
Can I touch on that? One more thing on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the coolest part about that all, I think now, is when people are coming in for interviews and we're talking with individuals, people will say to me, oh man, Brett, like, it's so great to meet you. I love this episode you did with X, and I learned so much from this. And to me, like, it makes me feel like really great that we're getting that validation, and the show has become something that people feel like is required listening before they go into the interview process. So, like, I know people who want to do podcast marketers, they get shut down by leadership or the C-suite, and they want to know the ROI behind it. Like, I can't tell you how much ROI. I don't have a spreadsheet with all the numbers and details, but like the indirect benefits have been paramount ever since we've started the show.
Love it. And if you ever do get that spreadsheet put together, let me know, because I'd love to share it. But it brings me to a question, though. Like, for you as a marketer, one of the things I heard early on in one of the episodes was you felt it would be important to interview these folks that you bring on, these modern day marketers, and then synthesize that information, reproduce it, repackage it from your perspective. So how does that help you as a marketer now, since you've interacted with a lot of these B2B marketers and you're like marketing and selling to these folks, which is different than what you've been doing in the past? Like, how is this helping you become a better marketer to them?
I mean, the access to people and their ideas, I view one of the things that I haven't really talked a lot about, but I really view like there's the intro call, then there's the recording, and then, there's the communication on Slack or email. Like, it's free consulting. Like, it's free consulting for me because there's so many great ideas and so many things that we learn through the process that I begin incorporating into our work. And I question why I'm doing some of what I'm doing based on what people say. So it's really leveled up what me as the leader of a marketing team in a very small company has really leveled up the way I approach my role, which is great. And I think the most important thing it's done for me is it's allowed me to have confidence when I'm in our product meeting and we're talking about building out new features and functionality. I feel like I have a seat at that table where I can offer really, really great feedback because I'm pulling themes together from the last, half a dozen episodes on things that they're doing or problems that they're having that is adjacent to what we're building. And so that's been really cool. And that's something I wasn't necessarily expecting. And we're just getting going on taking that recorded feedback in a conversation, synthesizing it and sharing it with our product team. We're just getting that flywheel going. And I think like when that gets spun up and we've got more engineers and we've got more resources, I think it's going to make for a pretty cool, it's going to help contribute to a pretty cool product that we're already building.
Yeah, I love that. So creating that internal flywheel that you're talking about on the product side, which a lot of people don't think about, because you're actually bringing on the folks that are, your core audience in a lot of cases. So it's like, why not use that information?
Exactly.
So I love that approach. And so that seems like that was an unlock for you, something you didn't necessarily see in the beginning. But what's maybe been another big surprise that you've had along the way? Because with 70 episodes, something must have popped up that you didn't expect, right?
Yeah, so I think that the thing that I did not expect was actually happened during intro calls. And I started to piece themes together that individuals were talking about. And it would be something like, we're trying to do things this way because B2B marketing is not very exciting and no one really goes to B2B content to be entertained and be educated. And people kept saying about it. And I wasn't saying, well, this person said it just on their own. And so I finally said, okay, I'm going to go into these calls with some intention to see if I can poke the bear a little bit. And we'd get done meeting and I'd share about the show and we'd talk a little bit about a topic. And then I would just say, hey, can you answer a couple questions for me before we close this out? And the individual would say, absolutely. And I'd say, okay, first question, why do you think B2B marketing sucks? And then after you get done sharing that, tell me what you're doing in your role to fix it or make it better. And it was like 15-minute rants. I just sat back and that was all the gold. All the information I had needed was right in those 15-minute rants. And it became so powerful that I realized we got to do something with this. So I reached back out to the individuals and said, hey, I want to create a series on this called B2B Marketing Sucks. Same thing I asked you. I'm going to compile them all into articles just to kind of bring some awareness around this topic that I know you care about. And everyone was like, absolutely, absolutely. And we published that right before we launched. And that was just a breakthrough for me and something that I didn't really expect to have individuals. And we're all in B2B marketing and it's all an industry we're working in. But to have so many people feel so strongly that as a whole, the industry sucked in the way we did marketing, and those individuals felt like they were the catalyst for change, like that's when like the modern day marketer breakthrough happened for me. And it happened organically, and it just happened with some reps and sets over time.
So Brett, you're actually using content from the pre-call and that's what you use to develop this written piece that you created. Is that right?
That's accurate. Yep.
Oh, I love it. So you're recording the pre-calls. You're asking these two big questions that then give you like just some material for written content, but then that also probably helps you develop the outline for the actual episode itself with the marketer, right?
Yeah, and it helps with social strategy. So many companies, I think, and brands reach for what they should be publishing on social and how they should be doing it. We just started to incorporate some of what we were hearing on the pre-calls in the tone and in the message on social, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter, and it resonated. And it was getting those likes and getting those retweets and getting those comments. It was validation that, okay, this isn't isolated to just the people that we're having conversations with, but there are people out there following us or following someone following us who sees that message and says, you know what, that's me too. Like I can relate to that. And that's powerful. That's powerful stuff.
Yeah. And so let me ask this, you're 70 episodes in, so you're seeing a lot of these benefits, right? You're sitting here almost a year later. So if you were to advise another company, when is the right time to launch a podcast?
I think the right time is when, based on the size and scale of the business, I think the right time would be when there is an individual who has a reason and a goal and vision for what the podcast is going to accomplish from a brand building, sales, customer success, product feedback. Like when they have that sheet and all those boxes are checked that they want to point the podcast at and hit those objectives, and they feel comfortable sharing that with internal stakeholders and get them to buy into it. So it's not we're 3 weeks into this episode, how many leads do we have right now? That's not the right conversation. But you have to have an individual who feels comfortable, who understands the power of the podcast, and has the ability to communicate that internally in a way that the stakeholders all say, you know what, this is something that I believe in for the long term, and let's do it. And once you have that internal buy-in and that passionate host who gets it, that's when you should start. If you don't sell it internally and get people bought in, you're probably setting yourself up for failure. So that would be my feedback to anyone who's thinking about doing a podcast.
Perfect. I love that mindset. That internal champion's really big. We see it with our customers. If you don't have that internal champion driving things and ensuring that you're remaining consistent, you do get hung up a lot, and that's when you suffer from pod fade and the damn thing just fades away, literally. Well, let me ask this. With all these episodes under your belt, you've tried a lot of different things. What's something on the horizon? Like what are you going to infuse into the 3Cs podcast that we can expect maybe over the next quarter or so?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's I was actually thinking about this unprovoked. I was thinking about this on my run this morning of, man, like, when you're in it, you don't really take a step back. And I had no idea we've done 70 episodes. Like, that's crazy. But to me, it's like moving into next year. Like, what do we want? How do we want this show to evolve? What do we want it to do? And I think what we're talking about is content. But content touches so many pieces of marketing, and you don't necessarily need to be a content creator to have an opinion or be involved with content. So I think my mindset has been around how can we turn this show into keep that content conversation rolling, but how can we begin to bring in other facets, whether it's a CMO who was not really focused on content, but now is focused on content and sees the sees the progression or individual contributors, just how they're thinking about their content and strategy, and how they're the piece that they fit into the larger picture. So I'm really trying to think about like people outside of the content marketing, content strategist role, and how we can bring their ideas and thoughts to the table. Because, just with the podcast example, it's never just one person or one role in B2B. And that's why we want to be more B2C. That's how we're all talking about it. But the buying process is always going to be B2B. So we really need to think about how we can bring in these other stakeholders and perspectives revolving around content. And so that's the turn, and that's the evolution. Do I know what it looks like exactly yet? Absolutely not. But I'm certainly thinking about how we can evolve the show moving forward.
Yeah, a lot of times we don't know exactly how it's going to look or whatever, but you just got to keep moving and evolving. And I think that's a good spot to end there, Brett. So for our audience, where can they go to find out more about yourself and the juice, and maybe also some wrestling here and there?
I'd recommend everybody not follow anything that I say wrestling related, because I'm a complete degenerate when it comes to that. But if you want to learn more about the juice, I recommend you go into thejuicehq.com, sign up, become a member, start enjoying a frictionless content experience. It's absolutely free. Go on, start searching, start checking out the content, the platform. I would love your feedback. You can DM me, follow me at Indy McGrath on Twitter. That's the best way to get a hold of me and reach me. And if you're interested in listening to the podcast, Mondays and Fridays, always new episodes drop. The 3C podcast, Curating Content Creators. You can find it wherever you listen to fine audio content.
All right. Well, Brett, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining me on Recorded Content.
Thanks for having me, Tristan. Really had fun with this one.